Hey, good morning and welcome back to my channel. This is the Reverend Sarah Liz, and I've got for you today the reflection, or if you like, the sermon that I preached on February 13th, 2022. I will admit that I did not preach it here in my living room. I preached it in church, but I am recording it here for you right now. So, in the readings that we had today, today we hear from the Sermon on the Plain, which is a little bit different from the Sermon on the Mount, which is a whole lot more popular. The Sermon on the Plain is from the Gospel of Luke. The Sermon on the Mount is from Matthew. The Sermon on the Plain is about God's take on aspects of concrete life, whereas the Sermon on the Mount is about God's take on the aspects of the spiritual life. What this means is that when Matthew talks about blessed are the poor in spirit, he's really talking about, let's say, the depressed, the anxious, the fearful. Now, no one that I am aware of who has ever had to deal with depression and anxiety and any of the various mental and emotional conditions that depression and anxiety can describe would necessarily say, yep, that was a time of deep blessing in my life. I could really feel God's presence and knew that because of it, I had nothing to fear. No, that's not really how depression and anxiety work, at least not for most people. I'd say that depression and anxiety is usually the time when we feel the least connected to God that maybe we've ever felt. But Jesus' point in Matthew is really important, and it's actually quite similar to the point he makes in Luke, which I'll get to in a moment. Matthew's point is this: just because you can't feel God doesn't mean God isn't there. Doesn't mean God isn't still loving you actively. And that's the definition of blessing. God's noticing you, God's loving you, God's still here for you, you are not alone. So just because we go through a terrible time in life and our own internal response careens down the path of depression and anxiety, and we are, in that beautifully archaic phrasing, poor in spirit, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. Now, that's what depression feels like. And I speak from experience on that one. That is what depression has felt like for me. Faith and reason told me that God hadn't abandoned me, but it sure felt like it. And faith and reason can be awfully cold comfort in the middle of a panic attack or a depressive episode. So that's Matthew. With him, Jesus is talking about spiritual stuff, which is also in our modern age understood as a kind of holistic mind, body, spirit level stuff. Okay. Luke, which we read today, Luke is totally uninterested in mind, body, spirit stuff. No, he doesn't care. He wants to hear about the tangibles of our reality, things we can touch, things we can more objectively experience. Now, we could argue that maybe, since these sermons are so very similar in content, that they both reflect just, pardon me, just one sermon that Jesus preached, arguably on a hillside or maybe on a plain. And it's possible. It's possible that because this is biblical interpretation we're dealing with here, and nearly anything is possible. But consider this. Jesus was an itinerant preacher. Preaching is kind of what he did. Yes, there were miracles. There were healings. There was the odd exorcism of demons into pigs. But by and large, he taught through stories and sermons. He did this on and off all day long. He did this on and off all week long, day in and day out, for 3 years. Let's think about this for a moment, friends. Some of y'all know by now that I can preach about love 56 ways a year without actually repeating a sermon. And then I can do it the next year with all new sermons. And I can do it the year after that with all new sermons. Sometimes I vary it up because I figure it might be a good idea to preach on something other than love, but there's never actually a time when I think, well, gosh, I've got this set of readings and I just can't figure out how to explain these readings from the Bible outside the context of love of neighbor, self, and God. I never have that thought. That is not a thought that I have. Because I really can explain everything in the context of love of neighbor, self, and God. It's my job. And I do it over and over. And some of you may have begun to notice by now. So it is possible that Jesus preached two very similar but not actually identical sermons at some point in his 3-year ministry of preaching. And Matthew gives us one sermon and Luke gives us a different sermon because everybody's got their favorites. Because we're humans. Having said that, let's look at Luke, the Sermon on the Plain. Luke's version of this sermon, that might be one sermon or might have been two separate sermons, it can be a hard one for people of any level of affluence to swallow because, and let me be super clear about this, it is critical of the wealthy and adoring of the poor. And by wealthy, I don't just mean the 1%ers wealthy. I mean people who have enough money to get by. People who don't actually have to worry about what they're going to eat for the next week or how they are going to feed their children for the next week. People who can breathe easy because they have a decent job or maybe a really great one. People who can breathe easy because they have a cushion of savings or maybe they're building one. Or they're getting successfully out of debt, or they're starting their own business, or they've just got tenure, or their retirement is going well. And y'all know perfectly well that what I'm describing here is part of the American dream. To have enough, to not lack, to experience abundance. Yeah, to achieve it through hard work and dedication, that's part of the American dream. But to literally have the capacity to build wealth. And to build generational wealth, meaning you can pass it on. This is defined in our Western capitalist culture as a positive thing. It is morally good. And here Luke is seeming to say the actual literal opposite. He says, woe to you. But blessed are the poor. And he does mean the ones with not enough clothes, the ones with food scarcity, the homeless, the destitute, the addicts, the jailed, the ones we might not want to talk with or talk about or welcome into our midst, wherever our midst is. Woe to the rich, and blessed are the poor. That's the sermon we get from Luke. Now, we've got options. We could just avoid this. We could just look at Matthew's version instead and focus on the Sermon on the Mount, which is a lot easier to swallow for anyone with a 401k. It's a popular path to tread. Many people have done it in the past. We could just focus on the Sermon on the Mount. Or we could roll up our sleeves and ask some hard questions. And the answers, maybe they'll surprise us. We could ask questions like, why would Jesus go there? Why would he say, blessed are the poor and woe to the rich? Especially if by rich, he actually meant kind of lower middle class and up. Not that they delineated it quite that way, but, anything other than abject poverty. And, to answer that question, I don't know. This is biblical interpretation we're doing here, friends. And that means that there are no guarantees on truth. And when someone says, "Ooh, here's exactly what that means," you should find that sus. That no. Don't check your brain at the door. But I can give you my best guess. So here we go. Here's my best guess. At the time of the preaching of this sermon, we hear in Luke, Jesus lived in a world that blamed the poor for being poor and lauded the rich for being rich. And it went even further than blaming the poor, which we're still quite fond of doing today. Except today we like to separate it out into categories. There's the deserving poor, which we shouldn't blame, and there's the undeserving poor, which we should absolutely blame. That's, what some of us like to do. But it went deeper than just blaming the poor for their situation. In the ancient culture of that time that Jesus lived and breathed and walked in, it was an accepted truth that if you were successful in life, it was because you were righteous and holy and God loved you bunches. And conversely, if you were unsuccessful in life, but this meant poor, but it also meant widowed or childless, if sickness befell you and your family, if tragedy struck, if anything bad happened, it was understood that was because God was angry at you. You'd sinned. Your parents had sinned. Somebody had some kind of secret sin, and this was God's punishment for you. Now, this is the ancient culture of the Jewish people that Jesus was dealing with. Obviously, these days, like the rest of us, they struggle with the question of Why do bad things happen to good people? And, the other side of that question, why do good things happen to bad people? But things were a little more black and white when Jesus was walking the earth. And my best guess is that Jesus was really trying to teach them another way, because you see him doing this in other places on other topics. So Jesus is trying to say, no, God is not angry at the poor. No, God has not abandoned the childless, the sick, the friendless, and the needy, the people who are crying. God loves them. God walks with them. God has never abandoned them. God will always be there for them, because actually God was always there for everyone. So stop pretending that some people are better than others. Sounds kind of like a Jesus thing to say. And the other side of that, all you folk who've got it made, who sigh in relief because you got the good job, you got the decent retirement, you've got warm clothes in winter and cool houses in summer, all you folk who think that this is the sum total of a good life well spent, and therefore look no farther, woe to you. You are missing out on the most important aspect of a life well lived, the love of God in and through and around your life. A life well lived is actually more than comfort and safety. And so yet again, we see Jesus turning expectations upside down. Just because you think God has blessed you doesn't mean you're finished. And just because you look at somebody else and think they're not worthy of God's love, it doesn't mean you're right. And that might be the meaning of Jesus' sermon on the plain. Amen.